Okay, so have you ever thought about like this whole idea that women are encouraged to like own their sexuality? It's a way of like, taking control. But it's like no one told men that that's the vibe now.
Mm,
I don't, did that resonate with you at all?
it does, actually.
Because I was reading this blog post the other day,
Yeah.
and it really made me stop and think about all this.
Yeah.
He was talking about this idea of Manolo Blahnik feminism
Okay.
and how there are all these potential downsides.
Interesting.
Like what happens when you try to rewrite the rules of the game, but not everyone gets the memo?
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it?
It is.
This whole thing with Manolo Blahnik feminism, like using high heels and, outward sexuality, all of that
Right.
as symbols of like taking control.
Yeah.
It sounds empowering at first glance, right?
And it does.
But when you really start to think about it,
Yeah.
there are some potential downsides.
Yeah, and you know that whole thing about men not getting the memo?
Mm-hmm.
The author of this blog post mentioned going to a gender dynamics panel,
Okay.
and that exact point came up.
Interesting.
Like, are we really talking about empowerment if it leads to these misunderstandings?
Right.
Or even puts women at risk?
Exactly. And that's one of the big questions this blog post is grappling with.
It is.
This idea that maybe Manolo Blahnik feminism is accidentally creating a kind of seller's market dynamic.
Oh, that's interesting.
And think about that in terms of power.
Yeah.
Who usually benefits most from a seller's market? It's the group that already has more power to begin with.
Right.
So it's like, are we really leveling the playing field, or are we just shifting the power dynamics in a different direction?
I see what you mean. And I'm thinking about some of the specific things this author was talking about.
Yeah, like what?
Like physical safety, for example.
Okay.
If men are misinterpreting these signals because the rules have changed,
Yeah.
it could put women in really vulnerable situations.
Absolutely. And it's not just about physical safety either.
Right.
There's also the emotional side of things.
Oh, totally.
The blog post talks about this cultural hangover, this feeling of emptiness that can come from like a string of casual encounters.
Oh, wow.
Like, yeah, you can have all these fleeting connections,
Yeah.
but what about building something real?
Exactly.
Something that lasts.
It's like we threw out the old rule book,
Uh-huh.
but we forgot to write a new one.
It's true.
Like whatever happened to the 3-date rule,
Right.
it might have been flawed,
Yeah.
but at least it provided some kind of structure, some shared understanding.
I know.
Now it's like anything goes.
And that's where things get messy.
Totally.
That lack of clarity, those blurred lines,
Yeah.
it creates so much room for misinterpretations for people to get hurt.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not saying casual dating is inherently bad,
Right.
but we have to acknowledge the potential downsides.
Absolutely.
Especially when the power dynamics are so out of whack.
For sure. Okay, so we've been talking about Manolo Blahnik feminism
Yeah.
and like all the good and bad that can come with that.
Right.
But I want to switch gears for a second and talk about women who are like choosing a completely different path.
Yeah.
Because we also had this Wall Street Journal article that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
It seems like totally unrelated at first glance.
Okay.
We're going from stilettos and like, sexuality to
Right.
Yale graduates and motherhood.
Interesting.
But I promise it all connects.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
So this article basically, it talks about this trend
Yeah.
of high-achieving young women, specifically these Yale grads,
Yeah.
who are choosing to prioritize motherhood over their careers.
Wow. And that's kind of surprising, right?
It is, right?
You'd think with all the opportunities they have, they'd be like leaning in, breaking glass ceilings, all that.
Exactly.
But they're making a different choice.
They are, and it made me wonder, like, what percentage of women are we even talking about here?
Yeah.
Like, is this a handful of people, or is it more widespread?
Well, the article actually cites a study
Okay.
that found that over 50% of female Yale graduates from like the class of 2006
Wow.
were out of the full-time workforce within 10 years.
That's huge.
It is, right?
And most of them said it was because of motherhood.
Yeah. Motherhood was the main reason they gave.
Wow. Okay, so this is not just a small group of women.
Yep.
This is like a significant portion of these highly educated, high-achieving women.
Exactly.
So then I'm curious, like, what are these women actually saying about this choice?
Right. Like what's motivating them?
Yeah, because it's not like they're just falling into some kind of traditional role.
Right. It seems very intentional.
It does.
Like they're choosing this
Yeah.
and they're owning it.
So what are they saying?
Well, there's this one quote that really stuck with me. This woman said, "I want to be the best mother I can be." And you could just tell she meant it.
Right. It's not said lightly.
Not at all.
There's a sense of purpose there.
Like a real conviction
Yeah.
that maybe we didn't see as much in like previous generations.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
It is.
It makes you wonder, though,
What's that?
like if these women had the same support system as men,
Okay, I see where you're going.
would they be making the same choice?
Right, like if their partners were totally on board with being stay-at-home dads, for example,
Exactly.
would they still feel that pull towards motherhood as like their primary identity?
Yeah.
It's a good question, and it's something that another woman in the article actually brings up.
Oh, really?
She talks about how like men just aren't faced with that same pressure to choose.
That's true.
Like society just expects women to make those sacrifices.
Well, even now.
Right, even with everything we've supposedly learned about equality.
It's almost like those traditional gender roles are so ingrained
They really are.
that even at Yale, even with all the resources and progressive ideals,
Yeah.
they still can't fully escape them.
Yeah.
So it's like, on one hand, we have Manolo Blahnik feminism, where women are trying to redefine power on their own terms.
Right.
But maybe there are some downsides to that approach.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, we have these women who are opting out altogether.
Choosing a different path.
Right, and embracing motherhood.
Yeah.
But it kind of highlights the limitations that still exist.
Exactly. It's like, which is it then? Like,
Right.
what does real empowerment actually look like?
Is it owning your sexuality? Or is it dedicating yourself to your family?
Or is it something else entirely?
Is it, right, like where's the line? It's like we're trying to figure out what female empowerment really means in this day and age.
It's a big question.
It is.
Right?
And there's no easy answer.
No, definitely not. And it's interesting because
What's that?
it's like these two things we're talking about, the blog post and the Wall Street Journal article,
Yeah.
they seem totally different at first,
Right.
but maybe they're not.
What do you mean?
Well, it's like they're both looking at this question of
Okay.
how do women navigate power and relationships and like societal expectations in a world that doesn't always make sense.
That's a really good point.
Right, because we're still figuring things out.
We are.
Like the rules are constantly changing.
Exactly. And both of these sources are kind of showing us different sides of that. They are, it's like the blog post is saying, hey, here is some potential pitfalls of trying to do things this one way.
Right.
And the article's like, but then again, some women are finding empowerment in a totally different way.
And neither one is necessarily wrong.
Exactly. It's not about saying one path is better than the other.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple ways to be a woman.
Yes.
Multiple ways to find empowerment.
And that women today have more choices than ever.
They do.
But those choices often come with these really tough trade-offs.
Absolutely.
Like you were saying earlier about those Yale grads.
Yeah.
Choosing between motherhood and career.
It's a classic dilemma.
It is. And it's one that men don't always have to face in the same way.
That's true.
So maybe it's not about finding the right answer.
Maybe not.
Maybe it's about creating a world where women feel supported in making their own choices.
Exactly. And feeling good about those choices.
Yes, and not feeling like they have to choose between.
Right. Like, why does it have to be either or?
Right. Why can't it be both or something else entirely?
And I think that's what we need to keep talking about.
We do.
Having these conversations about what it means to be a woman in the 21st century.
Absolutely. Because it's not just about women figuring this out on their own.
Definitely not.
It's about men being a part of the conversation too.
100%.
Understanding that true equality means
What's that?
respecting those choices, even if they don't fit into the traditional boxes.
I love that. And you know what else I love?
What's that?
This whole conversation we've been having.
Me too.
It's really got me thinking.
Me too. And I think that's what's so great about these deep dives.
What's that?
It's not about giving people all the answers.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions.
Exactly. And getting people to think critically about these important issues.
Yes, and I think we've done that today.
I agree.
So thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into Manolo Blahnik feminism and everything in between.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those reins buzzing.